Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
Let's talk about sports. Sports of yesterday, now, and days to come. All sorts of sports for all kinds of listeners. Enterprise Radio, the sports network, has plenty of talk 91 hours a week with well-known hosts and celebrity guests. You can converse about this and that by simply calling an 800 toll-free number. Get your share of sports talk. Enterprise Sports Network. You get more than the talk.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's indeed talk about sports, shall we? How are you? It's Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available. It's the curious little podcast devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for finding us. And a little fun excursion this week as we kind of step away from teams and leagues and players and events and those kinds of things and kind of take a true step back, courtesy of our guest this week, David Bockino. He professor at Elon University in beautiful Elon, North Carolina. And his new book that is a tour de force and a great read. And if you're a sports fan with a bit of a historical lens to you and you enjoy understanding how media in particular has intertwined with sports history, you will love this new book. It's called Game On: How Sports Media Grew Up, Sold Out, and Got Personal with Billions of Fans. It is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. It is just out as we record this. I think it came out on April 1st, if I'm not mistaken. And this is I think it's immediately going to be a go-to reference book for folks who want a decent understanding of how sports has grown up in the United States and worldwide for that matter, through the various lenses of media's maturation, especially over the last, say, 20 some odd years. But even before that, it goes through various iterations of media's evolution from print into broadcast and radio into, of course, television, which has a very seminal part of the history of sports, not only in this country, but worldwide. And now, of course, the internet and all things that the internet has now sprung from its loins, whether that be streaming and mobile devices and interactivity and gaming and all that kind of stuff. And who knows what to come. This is a tremendous book that kind of just puts it all into context. And you will love it for a whole bunch of reasons. But in particular, it centers on lots. I'm talking, tens, hundreds of events along the way that either you may remember that are obvious in terms of their importance in the evolution of sports and media together. And we'll talk about a few of those in our conversation. Stuff like Monday Night Football on ABC and its debut in I want to say 1970, I think it was. Or the Battle of the Sexes between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs, a television and manufactured for television, at that matter, sports event that kind of changed the trajectory of how sports might be presented and spectacleized, if you can make a word out of that. And those kinds of things. But also a bunch of stuff that is either maybe not obvious in sports media and the evolution of that. Like, for example, the WUSA, a topic we've talked about in the past, the Women's United Soccer Association, and the timing of that in the early 2000s when AOL was buying Time Warner and the perhaps a bit too early concept of digital buying out, if you will, and truly reinventing media by buying the old school stuff. The WUSA was a concoction of many cable executives at the time. John Hendricks, founder of Discovery Networks, prime among them. But how the WUSA was formed and then ultimately folded in a short period of time was almost sort of a microcosm of what was going on, the fits and starts of the original digital revolution. Some other, though, nooks and crannies that we love to obsess about that you may or may not even know that existed. Stuff like SportVision, which was one of the few companies back, which is about 15 years ago, maybe even a little longer than that, were instrumental in bringing the virtual 1st and 10 line that is now so ubiquitous on television. The digital battle for sports and the go-to websites for such. ESPN.com, which certainly emerged as one of the major victors, of course. But if you may remember, in the early 90s, there was something called Sportsline, which CBS wound up investing in and then ultimately sort of folded into their sort of nest as well. It was a battle for a couple of years as to sort of which one was the better ones there. And that obviously ushered in a whole new era of sports and stuff. But the one we just called out there with our little clip may even have escaped even your darkest of memories. And you would be excused for such because it only lasted for about 9 months. And this was in the year 1981. It was called the Enterprise Radio Network, or Enterprise Sports. And for those who, sort of are addicted, if you will, to sports radio, or certainly have grown up with it, I think a lot of people sort of erroneously think that WFAN in New York, for example, was sort of the progenitor of all this stuff in the mid to late 1980s, when the old WNBC turned in their AM dial signal to an all sports 24-hour a day, 7-day a week talk format, and certainly was perhaps instrumental in mainstreaming, I guess, the idea of 24-hour a day sports on radio. But the originator was actually this thing called Enterprise Radio, the Enterprise Radio Network. It was created by Scott Rasmussen, and if that last name is familiar to you, he was the son of Bill Rasmussen, who was the founder of ESPN. And as you may remember from our episode number 100, a young and, shall we say, not too quiet John Sterling was on the microphones at the Enterprise Radio Network, as were people like Don Chevrier, who was a longtime voice of the Toronto Blue Jays and a lot of Canadian sports, and even some wet behind the ears interns by the names of Kevin Harlan and Sean McDonough, who have gone on to very famous play-by-play careers, and a whole cast of characters at this thing called the Enterprise Radio Network in the, I think it was in Avon, Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere nearby, but definitely in Connecticut. And it was, as it sounds, the beginnings of sports talk. They did live cut-ins. I believe they covered or broadcast live coverage of the Stanley Cup that year, and certainly your phone calls. And many of those. And, again, the earliest days, not necessarily the most scintillating of radio programming, but it was ahead of its time. And it certainly, as you will hear in our conversation coming up with Dave Bockino, was certainly a harbinger of what was to come in the audio realm of sports and sports media. And that's the topic of our conversation this week, as we regale in the history. And it's chock full of interesting nuggets, some memorable, some forgotten, but it's all there in our conversation and in this book called Game On: How Sports Media Grew Up, Sold Out, and Got Personal with Billions of Fans, with our guest this week, David Bockino. You can get this book, of course, wherever you find good books. You can walk down the street to your local bookseller and have them order it for you. It's certainly a good thing to do. Keep them in business. Or, of course, you can go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Make sure you get all those S's correct. And you'll find a couple of convenient links when you search up this episode, which I think is 344. Yeah, number 344 of these things. My goodness. Just click on the convenient link or two, and you'll find the hardcover or Kindle version. And we understand there will be an audiobook version at some point, too, in the near future. So by the time you hear this, you may be able to get that version as well. And, of course, we get a couple of referral shekels of love when you do that, and we, of course, appreciate that to no end. All right, so let's get right to the chat, shall we? We had this conversation about a week ago. Strap in and enjoy this conversation with Professor David Bockino. As always, please enjoy. Let me start from this perspective. So I'm going to let my professional life creep into this admitted hobby of mine doing this podcast. So my day job has been for many years both in the advertising and media agency space, and now more independently as an investor, an advisor, and a board director in and around media plus advertising and technology. Okay,
Sure.
so you're talking to a guy who was one of the first believers in investors in stuff like Replay TV and TiVo and Roku and a whole myriad, Sling, the original Sling box, all these kinds of things that have a lot to do with not only how people consume media and have evolved, but sports, very much part of all of that stuff. So it's interesting how the worlds collide. But let me hear your background first, because I know you were an ESPN guy professionally before going to the ivory tower. You want to give our audience a bit of background on you?
Yeah, sure. So my first job in sports media was with ESPN. I think it was, what was it called? Ad sales research at the time. So it was under a gentleman named Artie Bolgren.
Artie Bolgren, a long time, for those listeners who don't know, all around good guy, a pioneer in media research, and friend of not only you, but yours truly from my professional life. So there you go.
Artie's a gem. He's a long-suffering Mets fan like myself. He's a great guy, and he was a wonderful boss and really laid the foundation for a lot of what ESPN does even today, although now it's kind of under the larger Disney ad sales umbrella. But worked under Artie and on his ad sales research team. So my main job was to position our properties against our competitors' properties, help the ad sales team basically sell our properties using research. And that meant a lot of Nielsen ratings. It was the early days of the internet, not early days of the internet. It was the early days of internet digital measurement, I should say. ComScore was starting to come out. We were still measuring print. We were positioning our properties against Sports Illustrated. And so I did multimedia ad sales research and basically worked with ad sales. And the best, what I tell my students is that working with ad sales people are great because you spend 2 weeks trying to figure out the best story. Why is our NBA telecast a better place to advertise than TNT? And the ad sales team says, cool, you have 30 seconds, give me one big number. And that happened all the time because that's how it was with the ad sales team. So I got decent at the sales part of research. And then I moved into ESPN International, where I was actually selling our properties. ESPN looked very different globally when I moved into ESPN International, which was in 2009. It's just changed a lot. Latin America's remained pretty similar, but Asia and what we were doing in Europe and kind of across Africa and some in South Singapore, we had a lot of extensions that sort of went away. But I was involved in selling our properties over there to domestic clients, and I was also in helping sell international clients on the domestic property. So a little bit of both. And then from there, those were my two big jobs at ESPN. And then went back to get my PhD and ended up at Elon, where we have a sport management department in a school of communications. They asked if I want to teach sports and media. And I said, that's exactly what I know how to do. And so I teach a little bit of media, I teach a little bit of sports, and I teach a little bit of sports media. And so it was kind of a perfect marriage.
Okay, so maybe a quick song and dance on I guess it's called the Sports Media Lab there at Elon, right?
Yeah.
For those who don't know where Elon is, please, why don't you tell them that? And I know it's a relatively new effort there. Did this book come out of that as well? Or, maybe a little
they sort of,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, they sort of came out at the same time. It's a great question. So Elon is about 45 minutes. It's right by, it's a little east of Greensboro, and it's about 45 minutes west of Durham. I actually live in Durham, which there's another college here that sort of gets some attention in March sometimes. But we like to talk about Elon. It's actually in Elon, North Carolina. And, when I went there, they said, yeah, you can do what you want in sports media. And so a couple of years ago, Well, actually, like about 5 years ago, I came up with a course called Through the Lens of ESPN. And what I do is I teach students the history of the sports media industry. We talk about the intersection of sports media society, but I do it through the evolution of ESPN as a company. I think it's pretty easy to do that. I think the book sort of uses the launch of ESPN as a turning point in a lot of ways, and we'll talk about that. And so this course was a way to teach students about sports media, but also, frame it around a property that they know really, really well, which is ESPN. The course was a travel embedded course, so we would, in the beginning era of the course before COVID hit, we'd actually go up to Bristol. We were able to get a couple tours of Bristol, Connecticut. We went down to New York, visited MLB, we visited Fox Sports, we visited ESPN ad sales down there. And then we actually would fly, and the course so far has gone to Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and Spain. And we visited ESPN in a couple of those places. And then we visit the sports media extensions over there. And we visit teams because teams have become an important component to the content creation side, way more so than they have in the past, right? There's teams with dozens of people on their content team. We visited Real Madrid. They have, I don't know, like 6 Twitter feeds. I don't know how many Instagram feeds. If you add up all their followers, it's in the hundreds of millions. And they're basically a content machine. So is Barca. Barca's selling off parts of their content to fund their massive debt. And so we talk about content in that vein too. Just how is it changing? How's it moving from broadcasters to players and teams, and what's the dynamic between that? And then from that, I said, man, I really wish I had a book that taught the history of sports media. There's a lot of really good books about sports media. I'm sure you've run into a ton of them. There's none that did what I wanted them to do, which is sort of trace that whole evolution in a readable format, non-textbook, that would help to engage the students. And so I kind of came up with the idea of Game On, which takes it back 100 years, but also puts a theme around it, that sort of ties all these different events together. Now, are there way more important events in sports media that I didn't include? Absolutely. There definitely is. This book could have been, 7,000 pages if you really want to go there. But I tried to isolate some that kept the story moving, the dates moving. And then the sports media lab was sort of extension of these two things as well. I started to realize, I had a ESPN executive come in, Norby Williamson, who was in the news a couple months ago for other reasons. Norby's longtime ESPN. He's a friend of Elon, and he would always teach in my classes or guest speak. And he'd say, I don't want to talk to these kids. I want them to tell me about what they're doing. And I got this idea that, hey, we're sitting on really valuable information, which is how college students are using sports media. And a lot of people want to know it. So I launched this entity called the Sports Media Lab that allows these college students to sort of explore how they're using sports media and their peers are, and then hopefully be able to present their research to industry leaders, which gives them practice and sort of creates a bridge to having them work in the industry as thought leaders going forward. And so that's how all those things sort of come together. And the home is the Sports Media Lab, which is cool. It's exciting.
So the bridge, right, between where things are going, these kids today, what their dynamic of media consumption and habits and thoughts and future ideations and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yet rooted in, like, you can't go forward unless you arguably understand the past from whence this came, right? And to me, that's why this book was it was catnip for me for a bunch of different reasons, but in particular for the zone of this podcast, right? Not unlike other aspects of media's evolution, lots of dead bodies along the way.
Sure.
And not all of them curiosities or oddities, but maybe at the time, but upon those pioneering efforts sometimes, right? Things actually evolved from and now create and dot the landscape that we know today. And that's, to me, is sort of like the bigger picture of all that stuff. So how does a book like this then come together, given the fact that you could go thousands of pages deep? How do you start to kind of frame the narrative? Do you do it sort of on a time sort of line kind of thing, or do you how do you sort of categorize all this stuff? And more importantly, how do you call it?
Yeah, so it was a lot of listing a bunch of events that just I thought of off the top of my head. And then going into those events and kind of taking tangents and finding more events. And eventually I just had this massive list of like, all right, here's a bunch of things that could get us from Dempsey Carpentier to Jose Canseco Billy football, which somehow became the prologue to my book just because it was such a ridiculous thing that I just I saw that parallel with 100 years and I said, this is just perfect and sort of describes where we're at as a society. And Jose Canseco, if you're not familiar, Billy Football is an intern at Barstool, which is not my favorite sports media brand, but it is the favorite of many of the students I teach. And Jose Canseco we all know who Jose Canseco is. And so I started with those two things. I said, all right, how do we get from here to here, point A to point B? And then I just started piecing it together. Some things were pretty obvious, like, when am I going to talk about television? When am I going to talk about newspapers? And yet, I left out a ton of stuff because I wanted to keep the years moving. So, someone asked me the other day, and this is, it was a fair critique. I'm actually not mad that I didn't include it. Like, I'm surprised you didn't include, Bill Simmons's Grantland. Grantland is like this revered site that's long gone now that people just talk about like it was, the second coming of God. And I said, well, you know what? I thought about it. I used a different Simmons anecdote. So Bill Simmons gets his due. And I also had something else in 2012 that I wanted to talk about. And I'm pretty sure that's when Grantland launched around that time. And I said, I didn't want to double up on years too often just because then I couldn't talk about the stuff going on with the year. So part of it was really narrative necessity. And part of it was, no, this will cover a topic that I really think is important, such as video games, right? Or talk radio. And so sometimes those things were very, very obvious. There's been tons of great books written about Mike and the Mad Dog. I wanted to write about Mike and the Mad Dog. I grew up in New York.
A documentary from one of our previous guests, Dan, who did the Spirit of Saint, the Spirits of St. Louis, Dan Foer, as well. Yeah, he did. Overdone. Yes, that topic.
Yeah, and so I said, I have to talk about the launch of WFAN. It was a huge moment, but I'm going to use that to talk about the larger what's going on with like the deregulation of radio and why talk radio came out during that time. And I'll throw in a couple, anecdotes about Mike and the Mad Dog. And so that's when I started saying, all right, how many of these topics have been, covered over and over again? And what's a different angle I can take? And so, chapter 5, where I talk about the 1958 Colts Giants game. Again, a topic that's been written out a million times. I think I take a different angle from that for that game. And I think I bring a story that people don't talk about as much in terms of the NFL using that game as a PR tool to really a degree that's a bit misleading in how many people watched it and engaged with it. And that's a topic that has become almost mythical in nature, the Giants-Colts game. And I think a lot of it is purposely manufactured by Rozelle and his team. And it's worked out great. And the audience for that game was not that big. It was not bigger than the Super Bowl before it, or the championship before it. And there were other football games literally that week that had bigger audiences. So that was sort of a different angle that I was taking in because a lot of people use that like audience number to talk about it. Oh, 40 million people watched it. Yeah, you know what else 40 million people were watching at that time? Every other show, because there were like 3 options. And so I think that taking a different angle on things that have been covered before was sort of what saved me from just repeating the same information over and over.
Sure.
Again.
And it's also been, the cliche is the greatest game ever played, right? So, I mean, it goes far beyond sort of the specific moment, but it crystallized a lot of stuff. And then, like you said, it took on a mythical sort of proportion. So, but I do have to give you a ton of credit because the readers of this book will be delighted, especially those who remember where they were in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when all some of these things that you've mentioned and more sort of occur. Because you do, even if you don't go into detail, you do throw a couple of bones to. So, for example, let's talk about sports radio. I mean, you mentioned this thing called enterprise radio, which
Yeah.
our previous guest, John Sterling, episode number 100,
Yo, yeah.
was on the earliest stage of. And while it didn't exist for very long, it was kind of sort of the second act, if you will, of some of the founders of ESPN on the television side. And arguably, it was sort of the first sort of sports radio network. It preceded WFAN by a bunch of years.
Yeah.
And then, you also talk about, a little later on from the audio perspective, this thing that made Mark Cuban an insufferable billionaire, this AudioNet / broadcast.com thing, which at the time, right, you even go into it, was sort of the beginnings of streaming audio on a listenable basis where you could hear out of market stations, which itself was an evolution from these 1-900 numbers where you could literally dial in to listen to the radio station. So talk about that for a second. I mean, that's right there. That's a little mini history of sports and radio / audio, right? That
Yeah, it's kind of
hugely important.
That's right. I mean, it's tracing back the audio. So like, I don't, to be honest, I don't remember why I started focusing on broadcast.com, AudioNet, Cuban. I always thought it was interesting that, Cuban, I watch him a lot on Shark Tank. Hey, listen, Cuban has way more money than I'll ever have. He's been way more successful. And so it's fun taking shots at some of these people knowing that
Well, fair credit. I mean, actually, you have to, if you really want to go back to the roots of audio, it's Real Audio, the company in Seattle, Rob Glazer, right? So I think in many respects, a Cuban kind of just took that to the next level and said, "Hey, let's just do that with radio stations."
Yeah, right. And let's do it before they come up with the idea to charge us for it. And so he sort of compiled all these things and said he didn't like his business model was mainly charging companies to broadcast their earnings meetings and conferences and things like that. And he was able to compile all this stuff and just say, look at all this stuff we have, and get someone to buy it for a couple $1 billion, until Yahoo got it and just said, oh, we can't do anything with this. And then immediately the company was devalued within like 3-4 years, same with the other companies. But it's fascinating to think about just being able to access out of town sports through the internet, and the stuff we're even talking about today with like how to monetize regional nets, right? And are we charging $30 a month in market? And then how much do you charge for something like NBA League Pass? Or how much do you charge for a standalone ESPN network? So that whole monetization stuff is just fascinating to me. And Cuban was just giving it away for free. And Yahoo just basically thought that they were going to be able to turn this into this massive machine, until these companies started saying, and these brands and these teams said, hold on, we're just giving you this audio for free. Let's take that, because they thought they were spreading their marketing brand, right? And then they realized, you know what, this actually should cost money. And so they started pulling it back, and therefore his entire model came crashing down. I mentioned in the chapter how fascinating it is. He was called the king of streaming for so long, and he sold the rights to the Mavs in market for years. He never launched his own streaming. He could have broadcast his own games and created his own streaming company, and he never did, which is so telling about how hard it is to actually do all the things at once, right? Provide the content and distribute the content. And that's sort of what audio is all about in terms of where do you find your specialty? What's the niche you can find? How do you build an audience? And so Cuban's a great example of that. But he was able to go from being someone who distributed content to someone who actually produced the content, which is what his basketball team is, I guess.
Yeah, famously, he also was not very high on the long-term viability of streaming video. He actually went hard on the HD front,
right?
And claimed famously that the internet backbone could never support high-quality streaming video at scale.
Right. Yep.
And now look at us, right?
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. So, I mean, what's sort of the divining rod here? Like, what's the BC/AD demarcation here, to strain a religious analogy? Is it ESPN?
I think it's ESPN, and I think if you want to get like the the underdog here. I think it's a court case in 1984 that basically took the television rights away from the NCAA and sort of handed it to the individual college football schools. I think that's a very important turning point in terms of the amount of content that we're able to see as consumers. So basically, the gist of the whole thing is that for years, the NCAA rapidly and very sternly controlled what college football games could air on broadcast television. And Oklahoma and Georgia basically took them to court and said, we want control of our broadcast. And in 1984, there was a huge turning point, a massive case that led to the break with the NCAA, where they don't control college football broadcasts anymore, gave it to the individual schools. The school said, hey, this is really hard to do. Let's sell this on a conference basis. And what you would see then is just more and more games coming up. And ESPN was part of that because they were able to show some of those games. But what I found fascinating is that you go into the literature and you go into, magazines and newspapers in 84 and 85, 86, and people are writing about how there's too many options now, like the fans going to tune out, ratings are going to go down, we're giving them too many options and it's going to dilute the product. And that's almost like still not true. What, 30, 40 years later, is that we just keep putting more things out there. The amount of sports we can watch as a society, if you just pay for all the streaming, is just unbelievable right now with all the streaming services. And so all those options and ratings are down in certain places. You don't get baseball is a great example, national baseball, national pro basketball. But if you add it all, if you cum it all, right? If you add up all the impressions across all these different things, it's higher than it's ever been, obviously. But I think that idea of college football splitting off and just being able, the ACC can air stuff, Big Ten started becoming more powerful. And I think that was a huge turning point in just saying, hey, you know what? The consumer will take more options. So let's give them as many as we can and monetize the hell out of it.
Yeah, and we even had a little bit of a tributary conversation about that with Rick and Dee Ray, the husband and wife team that helped found Raycom back in the day
Yeah,
in
sure.
the 70s and 80s, right? And the ACC college basketball stuff and syndication was kind of the way it go. You strung together a bunch of TV stations, mostly in the markets that,
Right.
and ESPN had to the ESPN wound up co-partnering with them
Yep.
to kind of get access to that, and then ultimately saw where the model was, and then took it national, so to speak, and now look at it. But so talk about maybe a sense though of television generally. I think probably it gets the outsized attention as being sort of the white hot comet of modernization of sports and the sports media industry, right? TV is prime still among it. And we can talk about in a few minutes where it's going, if it's going. Um, but even before ESPN, right? This notion of marrying big time sports events, or frankly creating them. I mean,
Yeah.
it's almost as intrinsic as the medium itself, right? I mean, we've had conversations about quote unquote pro wrestling back in the day and boxing in the earliest days, right? That the
Yeah.
Dumont networks of the world and whatnot, they
Mhm.
needed to put content on, and these live events, to the extent that they could do them, was certainly an attention grabber from the beginning, and wide world of sports and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, where in your narrative, I mean, I know the answer. Where does television sort of sit in all that, and is it given too much credit?
Too much credit for what? For basically launching
Evolving,
sports.
changing, and maybe force fitting sports, like cart before the horse at this point.
Yeah, right. Well, the book starts with sort of this idea that the narrative's always been manufactured in some ways, right? Talks about boxing matches where it was a lot of times it was the white guy versus the black guy, and why that worked for people and why that was able to, nurture this us versus them narrative. And, how else are you going to get that by just taking just features of humanity and breaking them into their most like the clearest demarcations, and promoters knew that, and they said this works great. So even when before radio, when people were staring up in Times Square at the ticker going along, right, they were rooting for certain people that looked like them or acted like them or were where they were from. And so I tell that to my students a lot, is like this whole like Stephen A yelling and McAfee and people yelling about these narratives, whether it's LeBron's not clutch, Skip made so famous. The narrative has always been supreme in the world of sports media. It's how that narrative's presented has changed over the years. Print didn't do it great, but they still had it. Print, you could still write about this stuff. It wasn't as visceral. Radio, it became more visceral because it was actually in your living room and it was, coming to you live. And then television put a face to it, literally. And you could actually see these two forces, whatever that narrative that they were building. Yeah, I saw that you had a wrestling guy on a couple episodes ago, I think. And
Yeah, John Longmead. Yeah.
yeah, and I'm sure you talked about Gorgeous George. He was a good example of this. He just searched around. He's like, what should my narrative be? Like, how do I get the most fame? He didn't really believe in what he was doing. He did it for fame and fortune and the camera, and people loved it. And they just made him into this German guy, and he would fight the Jewish guy, and they made it into, look, it's the German guy versus the Jewish guy, and it's not that different now. What they're doing to you know, how the media is talking about the LSU women's basketball coach, right? And the LA Times article that just came out, just pitting the good guys versus the bad guys, right? That people just eat that stuff up. And sports media has always capitalized on our inherent nature of just going with us versus them. And it just works really well in a visual medium. And that's why I think probably television has gotten the most attention. But yeah, it's been like that, through every possible medium.
I mean, I love in this book. I mean, you have sort of some major sports events along the way, not sort of like the most necessarily, but certainly ones that are representative of some of the themes. And some are obvious, like the FIFA World Cup thing and Our World, which was this television international concoction of entertainment that was simulcast across the globe,
Except in America.
except in the United States, right? Which, but actually, let me anecdotally, right? That actually in 1967, when it was broadcast, it actually became the seeds of something hugely popular and important in American
Right.
television sports.
Yep.
Right?
You're talking about Wide World of Sports, you're
Of
saying?
course,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't think Rune took our world and sort of made it that, but Wide World of Sports became a huge phenomenon. And now, I almost had a whole bunch about that particular program. It was a game changer. It was massively um, popular and important. I don't remember exactly why I didn't fit. I just think the timing didn't work, but it's huge, and it gave us a view to other cultures and other sports going on, and it was a big deal. And it's funny because I don't like something like that doesn't work as well now. I think it worked back then. It was novel. It was different to see all these different countries coming through your television, right? It was almost exotic in some ways, some of it, and so that really worked for the time and the era. And I think that's probably best manifest these days in like documentaries on Netflix or something where you're learning about a sport or a culture or a different place that you don't quite know that much about. But if you were to put that on, that would never fly on broadcast television right now. It's just not big enough for what it was. But back then it certainly was. And it was an important turning point in a lot of ways for the rest of sports media. But one thing I talk about with Rune especially is that they weren't putting on that program because, well, they weren't totally putting on that program because they thought it was, good for the United States to be exposed to different sports events. They were doing because it could be monetized, right? It could make money. It drew an audience. As soon as that was going to stop, then it was probably going to go away. And, that's one theme I have throughout the book is that I just wish, some of these executives just come out and just say, listen, what Don Ohlmeyer said, right? Don Ohlmeyer is the greatest quote of all time. I think it's the best thing. The answer to all your questions is money. I just think it's so true. And I just wish more people would just come out and be like, I'm just doing it for the money. And it's kind of refreshing when they do.
The irony is that and for those deep listeners of this show, that show Our World, which was what in June of 1967, came on the back of the first time in close to live presentation of the World Cup in 1966 on
Yeah.
NBC. It was, I think, tape delayed by a couple of hours. And the relative popularity of that broadcast in 1966 actually became the impetus for three, count them, and then one became two, still too many, professional soccer leagues that became
Right.
off the back of that.
Right.
So in some respects, it's a very interesting dynamic about how, in this case, the earliest days, television was almost, leading the charge versus the sport itself, right? Not unlike, say, the symbiotic relationship between the American Football League and television back in the 60s, right? So it's really interesting because you really kind of as you go through this book, you really get a sense, and not just the television media, but in specifically for television in this case, um, how intertwined the maturation of sports in the United States and the medium of television became. I mean, now it's
Yeah.
it's just ridiculously obvious now, but not so much in the 60s as things were, you said there were only three choices per se, maybe a local station or two if you're lucky in
Yeah.
a market. But my, oh my, just how the two almost were kissing cousins of each other.
Yeah. And that's true. And, they might have seen the success of 66 and just say, all right, maybe this country can support a professional soccer league. But, the television, the networks passed on the World Cup. I don't know if it's the next two or three because it just wasn't big enough. Like the amount of people you needed back then to justify putting on broadcast television, you wanted an audience in like the tens of millions if you were going on prime time, right? And so the World Cup might have been this, cool new exotic thing, but it wasn't going to draw 15 million viewers. So they probably would have preferred, hey, let's just put an episode of Gunsmoke on, right? Because that's going to draw a guaranteed 25, 30 million people. So in a world of such limited inventory, you really needed the massive hit. And that's what the 70s was all about, right? How do we get as many people as we can to watch this? Because that's how we'll get the most money from advertisers, the most eyeballs. And that's what Battle of the Sexes is all about, right?
Yeah, I
King
was
and
going to
Ray.
get into that, right? We've nibbled
Yeah.
on that issue. Maybe for some background for those youngins out there who don't know what that was. We said it before. That was a manufactured event, but you want to give it a little background and maybe a little sort of what
Yeah,
came
it was
from that.
absolutely. I mean, you're talking early 70s, right? You're talking women's lib, Roe versus Wade, Title IX, all happening at the same time. And Billie Jean King was, dominating women's tennis and this kind of getting older, really good player in his time, Bobby Riggs, basically he was manufacturing it too and started squawking about how, he could beat any woman. He wanted to challenge a woman to a tennis match. And he wanted it to be paid for it, obviously, and he wanted it to be on television. And so they had this big match. And the networks loved it because it's exactly what I was talking about it in that it had to do with this idea of how do you get the biggest possible narrative? How do you get the most people involved? And black versus white worked for a long time. And then they said, how about man versus woman? Because every single person in the country can relate to this in some ways. And so in 1973, they basically had this massive match where Billie Jean King played Bobby Riggs. And this is a great example of an event that's been covered a million times, right? And so what I use this match to do is talk about, all right, we kind of hold this match up as this big turning point for women in sports, women in sports media. Was it? And it's very symbolic and it's a wonderful event at the time. It didn't change a lot in terms of the amount of representation in sports media or the amount of coverage of women's sports. So I almost think we're doing it a disservice by saying it led to all these massive changes because, women had to fight for decades. And actually, this is a great time to be talking about this with the women's college basketball tournament destroying records right now. And people are talking about it now because it's new, it's novel. And so I kind of wanted to use that chapter to say this was an amazing event, but there were still decades and decades of fighting to be done, and things didn't change as quickly as they had hoped it would in 1973 after this match. And King won if you don't know that, and Bobby Riggs, and then there was this whole thing about was Bobby Riggs throwing the match, was the mafia involved, and Tom Van Natta at ESPN went down that rabbit hole, and I didn't think that was kind of worth getting into, but it's still it's this monumental event, and it was viewed by a ton of people, but it wasn't even the highest viewed program of the day. That was Bonnie and Clyde, a movie that was airing on CBS. So again, we don't want to. Artie would be, I think, happy that I'm talking about. Sometimes television ratings are misinterpreted and used to further agendas, and I'd rather look at them in the context of reality and look at the, how they match up with other things when we're interpreting the numbers the correct way.
All right, what's this? Oldschoolshirts.com. Fantastic. You've heard me talk on and on and on about the great folks and the great wares at oldschoolshirts.com. Like the name implies, it's old school and it's shirts, and they put them together, into what they call oldschoolshirts.com. It's like the name implies, but of course we love them primarily for their sports wear. You name the league of the past, you name the team of the past, the chances are huge that they're going to have more than one shirt and different color schemes for things that you may remember from the United Football League or the Major Indoor Soccer League or various flavors of the original XFLs, plural, or the Federal League perhaps, or maybe World Team Tennis, or maybe it was the North American Soccer League, and on and on and on. But hey, it's not just sports. It's also great cultural touchstones and memories from the past. How about the officially licensed Evel Knievel connection? How about collection? Yeah, that's what he's trying to say. Various colleges. How about dead malls of the past? Ice cream parlors, maybe even radio stations that you might remember. Hey, even there's a latest edition of the now old, Aloha Stadium commemorative shirt. All that kind of stuff and more. You will find at least a handful of shirts that you will just transport you back into your past, and you will amaze and impress your friends at the same time. It's oldschoolshirts.com, and we got a promo code for you, of course. Let's save you some dough while you go there, and its promo code is Good Seats. Good Seats. That's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Hey, P.F. Wilson and your friends at oldschoolshirts.com, thank you for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. All right, well, I want to get into your current and future hot takes on where stuff is. But before we get there, how about a little bingo game here of some of these maybe noted but not necessarily in depth here, and maybe you could also pepper this with some particular events or projects or something that are maybe either discussed in the book or not that you think actually have some importance that people maybe just don't even recognize. I'll start. I mean, I think you do mentioned in the 90s, this sort of battle between what became ESPN.com, formerly known as ESPN Sports Zone. And yes, I know that because I worked at Starwave at the time, which is where the idea got born.
Oh, did you?
A whole other story for another day. The battle with Sportsline, which CBS was kind of sort of involved with and sort of put money behind and all that kind of stuff. The ownership of the beginnings, if you will, of online sports information and news and stuff was not guaranteed to be ESPN's for the, right?
Yeah, no, no, not at all. And I think everyone was stumbling out of the gate and just saying, what do we do with this? How do we make money off of it? And the initial thing was, let's just give everything away for free. And that's sort of what became the model. And it's kind of people are still trying to roll it back even today. So the early days of the internet's fascinating because no one had any idea what they were doing, and to track that. And then it was compounded by everyone just pouring money into it. So you didn't even have to make money. And so they had these massive losses, but people were still investing. That's kind of led up to the dot-com bubble, and then everything sort of settled down after 2000. But it's a fascinating wild, wild west time. They're the 90s, and the best part is a lot of this stuff is preserved. So if you go on internet, the Wayback Machine, you could dig into these old athlete blogs and old ESPN, and it's just it. For one thing, I was very much alive and remember a lot of this. And so this was kind of when I was getting on the internet in the early 90s. So that's fascinating to me. But what a great time that was when people were just trying to get this new medium, and how much is this going to change our world? And the answer is obviously a lot.
I hear my dial-up modem beeping now in the background.
Oh my God.
How about
Every night.
How about SportVision? An interesting company out of Chicago. But the impact upon how people see live sports and what can be digitally inserted in that presentation is it started out pretty small and pretty reviled in the beginning.
Yeah, so I'm fortunate to work with one of the founders of SportVision, a guy by the name of Bill Squadron. He's a professor at Elon, and he has a Rolodex that puts mine to shame. So him and a couple other his friends and his colleagues came up with this idea, like, what if we put a virtual line 10 yards or wherever the team has to get a first down? And when I talk about it today in class, it's almost impossible to think about watching a football game without the first down marker. And the only time we have to do it is when it snows. And that has to do with because the first down marker actually plays off pixels of color on the grass. And when there's white on there, it gets confused. They can't use the same kind of pixels because a lot of the uniforms have white in them. And so they can't use the first down marker as well when it snows. And then when it snows, you say, man, this is a really hard it's hard to watch this game without that first down marker. And then there's more and more overlays and added innovation. And it has changed the way we watch it. It makes us more involved. It makes us smarter as fans, I think, a lot of the ways. And I think it can be overboard. I think a lot of people are trying to test how far do we go with this analytic stuff, exit velocities, and different things on the NBA court, which is, every second and every millisecond is tracked on those players. But a lot of the stuff that has been adapted has made sports better to watch and made us more intelligent as fans. And in the early day, you see a lot of people saw that first down marker and said, I don't want that. Our fans don't want that. It's too expensive. And then ESPN was bold enough to kind of jump in, and then everyone saw it happen on ESPN. They said, never mind, I do want that. And that's what happened.
Yeah, and Fox, I think, really took it to some extremes as well, and mostly
Yeah.
for good. And they, and that begat some other attempts, like the glowing hockey puck, which Fox will never live down, but I think at some point will come back as a retro at some point because hell, the puck is hard to follow on the screen, so it's not necessarily a bad idea to explore.
I don't blame Fox. I'm not a huge hockey guy, so maybe that's why. But listen, I'll always applaud a company for trying to make a viewing experience better. It didn't work. Hockey fans didn't like it. They thought it was embarrassing. They tried. You got to give them credit. You got to give them credit for saying yes to something when so many people say no.
Any other sort of events or technologies or things that maybe most sports fans maybe don't recognize were crucial or important, or you would want to call out and in
But one of my
infusing
favorite
people to
parts.
buy this book, of course.
Yeah, sure. But I take a couple international forays, and I kind of like those. I think it gives context. I can't say that I know the evolution of sports media in every single country across this world, but working at ESPN International gave me a really comprehensive view of just different national context, regional context. One thing I thought was really cool, fun to dive into was something called the World Series Cricket. World Series Cricket started by an Australian guy in the 1970s. and by the name of Packer, and he was basically emulating what the NFL did, which is turn a sport into entertainment. Monday Night Football was partly launched because they needed a new time slot to make money, and they thought that women would be more attracted to something in the evening because they were too busy on Sundays doing other tasks. And hey, let's add cheerleaders and let's add songs and intro music. And Packer saw that in Australia and said, I want to copy that, especially for a sport as old school and as boring as cricket. We're going to inject it with more fun. And it didn't work in the beginning, and it got off to a rough start. And he said, I'm going to keep at it, and it ended up working. And he sort of changed the game over there and breathed new life into a sport that was kind of wallowing in mediocrity in some ways. So that one was fun.
But
I
also
love
hugely popular outside these provincial United States, right? I mean, it's
sure. Yeah. Yeah, all the Commonwealth countries, anyone who was connected to England, India, Pakistan, South Africa, huge cricket. And now if you look at 2020 cricket in India, it's one of the fastest growing national leagues in the world, if not probably the fastest growing in terms of investment money. It's only 15-ish years old, something like that. But I also love the foray down to Argentina, where the government basically tried to nationalize sports, the National Soccer League down there, and then they just turned it into a political tool to basically advertise clients. And I actually do a project in one of my classes where I say, all right, pretend Joe Biden just bought the NFL and said, you're gonna get the NFL for free. It's gonna come out of your tax money. You're gonna get every single game, but during the NFL, I'm just gonna air commercials about Joe Biden. And I say, how will the American public react to this? And you get some interesting stuff.
well, yeah, you could or you could use the other candidate and probably get the
Yeah,
same kind of
right.
diametric. I also, before we get your sort of hot takes on where things are now and going forward, I was pleasantly surprised to see you leverage the rise and fall of the 3-year-old WUSA at the turn of the century, the 2002 to 2001 to 2003,
Yeah,
as a place to hang your hat on this at the time, this media convergence thing, which this was
yeah,
obviously against the shadow of AOL and Time Warner coming together, or AOL buying Time Warner, on this grand vision that it was time for classic media and digital media to finally come together, so to speak. And we all know how disastrous that wound up becoming in the media realm, but maybe the microcosm was the WUSA prior to that.
yeah. No, absolutely. And it was a bunch of cable people coming together and said, let's launch our own league in some ways. I use that. I think that's such a great parallel to what's happening with the streaming services right now. Netflix is pretty good at creating their own content, but companies like Disney and HBO and I guess the larger like Warner Brothers Discovery, they're saying, you know what? It's hard to produce our own content and distribute our own content and make money off of that. We had a good thing going when we were pawning off our content, our syndicated content to Netflix, and they were paying us tens of millions of dollars a year for Friends and The Office. And now when we take it back, it's just hard to monetize. And that's what the WUSA was in some ways. It just saying, we're going to do all the things and we're going to do it really well. And then they realized that, wait a second, it's actually hard to do all the stuff really well. And so they sort of had to take a breath and pause that experiment for a little bit. But it was definitely a fascinating, 3-year up and down. And that obviously came off of the excitement of 98 when the women, or 99, sorry, when the women won the World Cup in such dramatic fashion. So a lot of this is just people saying something really big happened. Let's make it, let's extend that and capitalize on it. And then they say, oh, wait, the excitement died down. We need to roll it back a little bit.
We have seen that time and time again in our sort of explorations, right? I mean, the World Cup we talked about in 96, in 66, Olympic volleyball in 1976, and the foundation of this thing called the International Volleyball Association. And you mentioned the women's soccer thing, but maybe this is a good segue. I mean, fast forward to today, the third major attempt at a women's professional soccer league, the NWSL, by all accounts, is doing gangbusters. Maybe more exquisitely timed than the pioneers back in the early aughts. What do you make of the ascendance of women's sports as we record this? Right, the women's NCAA Final Four is approaching, and coming off last week of just gigantic ratings. That was one of the highest rated the Caitlin Clark led Iowa
Yeah.
Hawkeyes game against LSU. Was one of not only one of the biggest women's basketball games ever viewed, but one of the most viewed college basketball games from both sexes, as well as sports broadcasts over the last number of years. I mean, just phenomenal. I don't think who saw that. Maybe you did. Where do you see women's sports now and going forward? It seems like there's a huge breakthrough now for that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that number was astonishing. 12.3 million watching a women's college basketball game is just great. And it does show how far we went. And I think there's a couple of reasons why. I mean, I think it's only uphill from here or downhill from here.
I think downhill, but yeah.
Yeah. I think it's going to go great from here on. There's going to be bumps in the road. I think there's a few things you could say about why this is happening now. One of it is social media. I don't think we can ignore social media. It took away this idea of the gatekeeper, right? A lot of these athletes can build their own brands online. A lot of the young people that I know follow young male and female athletes as they're coming up in high school. And that's a huge way to build your brand and get your people to pay attention to you. So I think that idea that, it doesn't have to be on ESPN Sports Center to know who you are anymore, it has helped women's sports a ton because, women are on social media too, and they're able to build their brands, and they're kind of equal in some ways to men in terms of having the ability to spread their brand. Absolutely. So that's one thing that's helped a lot. The second thing helped is that we've come a long way as a society, and there are brands now who have dedicated ad sales budgets to supporting women's sports, purposefully going out of their way to find those opportunities. And that helps some of these leagues when maybe they're working to get a media contract to have some of these big brands behind them, giving them money to support them. And that's great. They can get their footing because it's hard. It sounds like you talk about this stuff, not as a living, but as a hobby. How many leagues have come and gone in 3 years because, it's hard to start something new. I mean, we could talk about spring football. You probably have for hours, right? How many times has someone tried to start a spring football league and it sputtered out? And so to know that there's financial backing behind you, that's going to be more than just 6 months or a year, has really helped a lot. And the other thing with society, it's just, there's more women in general, young women, especially growing up watching sports overall. I see sport management, I teach sport management classes. My guess 20 years ago, it was more like a 90-10, 80-20 breakdown in terms of male and female students. It's a lot less now. It's still more male, but not as much. They just have it from an early age. And part of that's, again, the accessibility. They can watch on their phones. They can watch whatever they want. And so with all these networks now looking for more content, that's only going to help. ESPN wants more content. They want more things to show on just because there's more competitors in the space now, right? There's more streaming services, there's more online. And so to have women's sports basically fill in those gaps and gain popularity from there, it's only going to go better in the future. Like the future is promising. I don't think this is a blip like some of these other times. I think this is sort of the building block that's going to continue.
All right, but the counter narrative on that, though, or maybe the parallel part of the conversation is the medium of television itself, right? Which has been for decades, many decades actually, such a huge engine and conjoined, if you will, at the hip with sports over that time, and now is in the midst of, as we record this in early 2024, in the midst of a kind of an identity crisis and maybe worse, right? As streaming and social media and the linear television consumption trends are going down and cord cutting and the like. Obviously, sports still commands large audiences, especially things like the NFL and occasional spectacles such as what we're seeing now in women's sports at the Olympics. But it feels like it's having a real, real challenge ahead of it. I mean, what's happening to that? Is the money still going to be as strong and as important and as consequential? I mean, the possibilities of it becoming all streaming and completely shredded into bits may undermine the very, very power that television brought to sports in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to the first thing you'd have to do in that is like define what television is, right? Is television the physical object that you're watching it through? Are you talking about broadcast television? Are we talking about cable television? I ran a focus group a couple weeks ago. We were talking about ESPN, the standalone ESPN product that's going to launch next year, and I wanted to get a gauge on like how students were going to price what was it going to cost. It's always fun to ask college students what things cost because they just have no idea. So I was doing that, and one of the students said the most fascinating thing that I've heard probably in a couple of years. He said we were talking about ESPN, and then I was explaining the business model of cable television to them, and he goes, "Oh, that's interesting. I've never really associated ESPN with cable television." And, for someone who got paid from cable television for many years, and ESPN made billions of dollars from cable television every year, it was such a fascinating statement to think that the idea of cable, linear streaming, that's not a thing for young people. It's video, it's the game, right? So if you're thinking about just that game in general, that's going to be available in some capacity and it's going to go through hiccups, but it's not going to be this massive change where, oh, we're just not on television anymore, it's on streaming. I think that sort of distinction's going to go away a little bit, especially as more people get comfortable just finding these streaming apps, whether it's through Roku or smart TVs. Now, I think the bigger question is, all right, we have these events that used to draw huge audiences, right? The NFL is an outlier. We can't talk about the NFL like we talk about other things. College football, in some ways, is a bit of an outlier. We have a lot of options that are going to get these audiences. And that's kind of one of the points of the book is that this idea of sports media being this collective experience, as it was in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, is sort of changing. And what I'm seeing a lot is this personalized sports media experience where everyone's sort of picking their own menu, their own diet of sports media. And that doesn't mean that we're not all going to watch some events together. We're all still going to watch the Super Bowl. But even within those big events, there's different things that we do. We might have, we haven't even talked about gambling. I consider sports gambling an integral part of the sports media evolution and where it's going in the next 20 years. That's all I've been talking about for the last 2 weeks because we just went legal in North Carolina on March 11th. And so we might all collectively be watching these things, but we have our own interests in those particular games, whether it's a player prop that you bet on or your fantasy team, or you're rooting for an individual player. And then when you shut that off, you might turn on a German soccer game, or you might turn on a college basketball game that, your dad went to that school, your mom went to that school. And so this idea of just fragmentation in our own diets is changing the way that we look at sports media, and it's got to change the way that they monetize it. And that's what's challenging for a lot of these companies is getting people just to pay for all these different things when there's so many different options. So I don't think the notion of just the game is going to change, watching the game, but I think the notion of just how we all experience these games as a society together has changed and will continue to change in the near future. I don't think it's for the better, but I'm also not a super huge pessimist about the whole thing.
Well, okay, and to me, from a classic sort of sports fans perspective, right? I don't want to be sort of old man yelling at the clouds, but you have to wonder not if, but when a serious breach, a compromise of the integrity of the sport, the sports, when that gambling scandal occurs, or the underbelly of we see European countries kind of now sort of retracting the ability to have advertising during the games and that kind of stuff. The deluge of new money now in college sports with NIL and the gambling influence there, and those kinds of things, and television, the money and all that stuff, the super conferences and stuff. So I while I also try to be as much of an optimist as possible, I'm a media futurist, if you will, by trade. It's hard not to think about some of the potentially corrosive effects that might sort of come with all that money, all the splintering, all the changes um, that may compromise the sports themselves. I don't know. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I also worry seriously about some of the I don't know some of the things that made sports and teams and leagues and all that stuff, the competition special in the first place.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm in a tough spot in a lot of ways because I do think sports gambling should be legal. I just think it's been around so for so long and it's been so huge that to not have some sort of legal structure around it just
Hey,
seems
it's how we
silly.
got
It's like,
lotteries, right? It was a numbers racket that the mob was running back in the, or
yeah,
in the
policy
1800s,
numbers,
right?
whatever you want to call it. And those guys were running, point spreads and coupons and parlays on college football games. I'm working on a gambling project now that traces the history of gambling. And I talk about a lot of the historical stuff as sports was built on gambling in a lot of ways, if you want to make that argument, which I did, which I am. And I think it should be legal, but I really don't think that widespread legalized gambling will be good for sports. And then again, we get to this point. Okay, what does sports mean? Right? Who are we talking about? Are we talking about executives who, get bonuses based on a guy like Roger Goodell who gets paid, X amount of money if the value of these owners' teams keep going up? A lot of people ask me, why the change? Like 10 years ago, a lot of these commissioners were like, this stuff's terrible. I don't want legal, maybe 15 years ago, gambling's terrible. And I say, because DraftKings was willing to pay them $200 million a year to become an official partner. And they saw that and they said, oh, here's another revenue stream, sign us up. That's why it's legal now. You can make any argument you want, but it's because these companies became huge because of the internet and they saw dollar signs and they saw ability to sort of add this revenue stream to what they already had on top of their media rights. Now, I do think that a lot of these companies are going, I think in general, we should have done more from a policy perspective to limit advertising and to limit all this free money that's been given out.
Yep.
I think it's absurd that a 21-year-old can just say, oh, here's $200, go try this really addictive activity that you might get hooked on. It's nearsighted. I don't blame the betting companies for doing it because they need to get customers. They're all selling the same product. They need to get customers somehow. And if it's throwing free money at them, fine. I think we should have done better as a structure, just saying, hey, you got to limit that stuff. You got to get customers, a different way than just tempting them with a really addictive activity. And that's empirical science. Like sports gambling can be very, very addictive. And so that makes me super uncomfortable as well.
Yeah, I mean, young adult males, right, are very impressionable. Arguably,
Yeah,
their sports
absolutely.
loyalties, as we've learned, as our little history project is proven, like in their teenage years or their preteen years, it's where sort of the affection and the attachment that comes in the beginning for teams and sports and leagues and that kind of stuff, and those memories to continue. And then as you get into young adulthood, right? I mean, what better way to sort of continue that passion, that interest, and maybe make a few bucks on the side. But there's clearly the stuff on the side of that. But I don't disagree. I mean, you see it already. I just worry about sort of as I said earlier, sort of the proverbial cart leading the horse, and
Yeah.
you just don't want to see the integrity of what makes sports great and such a must watch or must attend get tarnished or worse in the process. And look, as you talk about the history of betting and the history of sports, right? There have been plenty of events along the way, college and pro in particular, where some of those levees have been breached over time. And I just think they could be more cataclysmic this time if we're not careful.
Yeah, I think they could. I think pro athletes in general now have the ability to make so much money that it's going to be hard for, I was saying that after, John Tate Porter, there's rumblings about different things, but I'm worried most about the college athletes. I think something could happen there. But what kind of concerns me the most is, the best part of sports is being at the event with people who are rooting for the same team, that collective spirit when a team, I went to Penn State, just being inside 110,000 people all cheering for the same play and wearing the same white outfit. And this fragmentation of the sport media experience and gambling coming into it, even after fantasy sports and where they're all rooting for different stuff. And, I mentioned this in the book, but you go to these big collective events and everyone's got their phone up and getting their own picture of the game, their own video of the last play, instead of just, why do you need to have that for yourself? Like, why does it have to be yours? Just enjoy the moment as a group. And that's sort of the stuff I love about sports is that group stuff. And you wonder if they were kind of going away from that. And that reflects larger societal trends, right? Breakdown of traditional community groups, breakdown of religious communities, just people more isolated on social media. And I think it's just a manifestation of that larger isolation of the individual, partly because of the way we consume media. I don't want sports to go down that same route. I don't know if it is, but you see part of it already happening for sure.
No, no, and I think a lot of the future is also experiential, right? To encourage people to go to these games or these little mini hamlets like the Atlanta Braves park now
Yeah,
have, and all these every stadium that needs renovation is now trying to emulate. They're trying to create their own little villages and revenue streams that have nothing to do with the actual day of game experience. But even at
yeah.
the day of game experience, right? How technology and other things, God forbid the average consumer can afford these things going forward, but we'll see. I also worry about private equity and then the ballooning of salaries and all that stuff, pricing people out of these experiences, or worse, only for the certain milieu that can afford them. And I don't think that's a good thing either, if you think about it.
The private equity thing, I think, is a completely different conversation that is equally alarming.
Another book, maybe, huh?
I think we've only scratched the surface of what's happening there. And I think the repercussions of all these groups coming in, taking stakes in a lot of these professional franchises. Yeah, I think that's a huge issue that's gonna that's that's really gonna dictate a lot of where sports is going in the next 20, 30, 40 years. But you talked about those little hamlets and Billy. I love how the way you put that. And I have for decades just never understood the allure of the luxury suite. I've been lucky at ESPN. I've been lucky to be in enough of my suites. I hate them. I think it stinks watching a game there. Like, I never thought it was cool watching from a suite. I think I'm isolated from the crowd. I want to be in like the student section. I'm 43 years old, but I want to be down in the group. Like, that's when I have the most fun. I don't like being apart. I went to the Mets opening day with my son, and we had club tickets, and just because there was an overhang, I thought it was going to rain. The whole story, but we're out in the stadium, and then I walk in to get some food, and there's these people just like sitting on couches in the club, just in the middle of the game, and it's sunny out, and I'm like, I can't wrap my head around that. I just don't understand why you would pay tickets to go to a game to sit on a couch watching a TV.
It's
I
almost
just
as if the game is in the background, and that's I agree that the casual fan may want to pay for that kind of experience, but it's kind of an expensive way to chill.
Yeah, just stay at home. I don't
Right.
know. It's working. That's why these clubs are doing it, I guess. They're making a lot of money off it. I don't understand it. But if I was in their position, I try to tell my students that, right? Like, you can criticize someone if you're in that position and it's working and it's driving a revenue and it's making your salary go up, which means your kid can go to a better school. You're going to be the one who says, "Nope, I'm going to do this out of principle." Maybe you will. Probably you're not, and you're just going to do what everyone else does and sort of follow the money, right?
Well, okay, but I do to bring it back home. I will just let you promote here in a second. The history does matter, right? And
Yeah.
if things collapse or go sideways or cyclically, economically, downturns and those kinds of things. I mean, this is where actually history can be instructive.
Right.
And I think, the one thing that I think is really noble of of how you teach your kids today, and obviously the content of this book, is that it roots in the evolution and the history of stuff. And it's also sort of a reminder, I guess, that history may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes a lot. And to know some of the things that have occurred even decades or maybe even a century or two before, some of these ideas actually, and we've learned this through our little podcast, are not necessarily new. They're just skinned a little differently.
Like
things like betting and things like, franchise model versus league owned and those kinds of things. And, all that kind of stuff is just, these are just new flavors of the same things. And to not know that is probably detrimental.
I mean, you 100%. I totally agree. When my wife read the book, she works at ESPN too. She still works for Disney. She actually, one thing she goes, I had a highlighter, and every time you said something that's just still happening today, but just in a different context, I highlighted it. And through the 20s, 40s, she goes, this is still happening. This is still happening. This is still happening. It's just, it's in a different outfit. It's all the same stuff that we've always faced, but yeah, you're right. Skin differently, whatever it is. It's the same issues, the same problems, the same decisions being made for the same reasons over and over and over again. And yeah, that's why I think it's important. Before I started working at ESPN, I do wish I had a book like this. And, at one point I'm like, I don't know, I should pitch this to like HR leaders who distribute this. Hey, learn a little about the industry that you're a part of, because, you need to know that in order to chart the future. You're absolutely right.
How interesting was that? My goodness. I hope you didn't mind me getting my geek on with that conversation. We thank the good professor, Dave Bockino. He is associate professor of sport management, again, at Elon University. That's in beautiful Elon, North Carolina. And he also has founded and runs the very compelling sports media lab there at Elon. You can check all that stuff out at elon.edu for all the stuff that they are up to. And I think it's great. It's I love the fact that, of course, this book is sort of an historical look back, but also it sets the foundation for whatever he's teaching these kids today about the new avenues that sports and media are undertaking. So we appreciate Dave's time this week. Of course, the book is called Game On: How Sports Media Grew Up, Sold Out, and Got Personal with Billions of Fans. It is published by our good friends at the University of Nebraska Press. Of course, you can get it wherever good books are found. But if you'd like to do us a favor, you can do that by going to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode number 344 with Dave Bockino, and you will find, conveniently, a link or two or three to said book. You'll find it in hardcover version, a Kindle version, and depending on when you're listening to this, you may also discover it available in audiobook format. Either way, get your hands or ears on it now. Sooner rather than later, you will enjoy this to no end, and you will be surprised at the various nooks and crannies of sports history in media that you will be taken back to remember. Lots of great things remembered and forgotten in this book, and it fills a gap, I think, and it certainly will now have a prominent space on my bookshelf as well. While you're there at goodseatsstillavailable.com, that's of course where you'll find every single stinking episode we've ever done. We post them all there for you. Of course, the best way for you to ensure that you don't miss a thing is to subscribe or follow us on your favorite podcast player, he says, or however you ingest podcasts. We're available wherever you can get them. And for whatever reasons, if your favorite podcast app doesn't somehow get our feed, please let us know and we'll fix that toot sweet. While you're on goodseatsstillavailable.com, lots of good stuff there. And I want to now introduce to you, this is the first time we've actually done this, there are two new buttons, new tabs on goodseatsstillavailable.com. One is the support tab. If you'd like to just tip us a few bucks through our friends at Ko-Fi, we like to call it buying us a cup of coffee. You can do so. You can do it on a fairly regular basis if you'd like, or if you feel guilty after listening to all these episodes for 7 years and you want to give us a couple of bucks of thank you, well, go right ahead. It's very painless. We take it's the PayPal thing, or I think I don't know what other mechanisms it uses, but if you'd like to give us a little hat tip, if you will, by doing that, please do so. And wait for it, drum roll, please. We have a merch tab as well. Yeah, we're going to try to build that out a little bit, but we feature two of our most prominent advertisers over the years. Our friends at oldschoolshirts.com is featured on that page, as well as our friends at Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks, on that page. But we also want to ensure that you know about our new relationship with TeePublic, where you'll find some links here on the site for, wait for it, official Good Seats Still Available merch. Yeah, you'll see our little logo there. It's available on all kinds of different things, and buttons and shirts and jerseys and mugs and all that kind of stuff. But also tons of defunct logo items, courtesy of our friends at TeePublic, TeePublic.com. And you'll find those links right there on that website. Just look for the merch portion of our website. Our social media, of course, follow us there. We're on Twitter/X at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find us on Threads at Good Seats Still Available. And you will find us on Facebook at Good Seats Still Available. Would you like to send us some email? You could go right ahead and do so. We are at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Make sure you get all your S's correct. And our thanks, of course, this week to the great Jerry Payne. He of Jerry Payne Audio Excellence, enjoying some of the early doings of the Atlanta Braves this season. We'll see how long that lasts. And we hope that you're enjoying the baseball season thus far and are eagerly awaiting spring, as we are, for all kinds of fun and frivolity. Hey, the UFL is back, or what is started. We've got baseball coming up. MLS is starting to hit in the high gear, and the Masters, all that kind of stuff. Hope you're enjoying it all, and more to come next week in our little genre. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you then. Be well. Bye.